What I wanted to do today is actually cover some mistakes that I see new cooks make on a regular basis. For those of you that are new to 86, I teach soft skills, I also do recipes, and I just cover general stuff within the food service industry. You know, I was new, I did a lot of these too. It takes a lot of time to, hammer some of these things out. First one I wanted to go into was not reading the recipe all the way through. Now, a lot of places, they'll have these like standardized recipes. They'll have things written down on them, different instructions. They'll have an ingredient list, instructions, and the instructions are written differently than you might get in a a cookbook. Usually there'll be like a table somewhere. You might see in the table, you'll see the ingredient, and then next to it, you might see like an instruction, like sliced thin or something like that. The first thing when you're reading these standardized recipes is whenever you have to take whatever it says literally. And if you're getting recipes that say something like onions chopped, that literally means rough chop. You might hear people complain about like, oh, why do you need to use all the fancy lingo like julienne and stuff like that? It's because the recipe calls for things a certain way for a reason. Julienne yellow onions are going to cook differently than fat diced red onions, for example. And so if you need to throw them in a saute pan and cook them super quickly, and you have a bunch of really heavy, thick cut onions, it's not going to cook the same, so it's not going to taste the same. The recipe's not going to be the same. One of the most important things for recipes is consistency. So make sure when you get a new recipe, read the recipe all the way through, look at everything, get all your meats together, get everything that you need to make it, and then make it. Right? Don't look at the recipe and read one instruction and then go do that, and then read another instruction and go do. You want to just do it all at once. Grab everything you need. Next one is overcrowding the pan. If you're ever running saute, or you're using something like a tilt skillet, or you're using something where you have to get like a brown, you got to get that Maillard reaction on the chicken or the beef or whatever it is. You can't add too much to the pan at once. This is more true you run into this more with institutional cooking, or if you're cooking at like a school or something like that. Tilt skillets are like as big as this desk, and they're just like a giant skillet, right? And you can turn them on and get them up to like 350, 400 degrees or whatever. But then what people do is they grab like 60 pounds of beef and they throw all the beef in there. And at first you hear that sizzle, but then it starts to go away because there's so much meat in there. It basically just starts boiling it, and you're making like a soup. If you are braising the beef, it is not such a big deal. Like, obviously you still have to brown it before you actually do the braising and put the braising liquid in. But like once all the liquid's in there and everything like that, you're basically just setting it up to braise for a long period of time. If you are having to brown chicken or brown something, and this is true for saute pans too, you get a bunch of stuff in there and you end up boiling it. This mistake is something that home cooks will do all the time too. They want to rush through it. They want to get it all done. There's a whole bunch in there. Just do it in batches if you need to brown something. That's it. The next mistake that I see a lot of home cooks and new cooks make is using the wrong temperature. I've seen people do this more often, where they actually use a temperature that is too low for the pan. When you're new to cooking, a lot of times you've learned how to do some things at your house, right? When you cook at your house, you cook everything at like a different temperature. Some things are lower, some things are higher, and you're going to do that on the line too. A lot of times on saute, you're actually going to be cooking at a really high temperature because you need to get everything going, and it needs to be fast. You need to keep that heat high, and you can't let the pans cool off too much. Most of the time, your heat is just going to be cranked, and you're going to be throwing things in pans, and you're going to have like 6 pans on 6 different burners, and you're going to be like kind of like a chef DJ, right? Where you got like your onions and your beef and your this and your that, and you're kind of monitoring everything. So having your temperature set too low could be a problem, and you could end up really lagging on the line. Now, the flip side of this is things like shrimp or a butter-based sauce, like some kind of finishing sauce or a pan sauce where you throw butter in. You don't even need to have the pan necessarily on the heat when you do one of these sauces. You need the butter to be melted, but you don't want to be like cooking the butter. You don't want it to separate. You end up with a broken sauce, right? People will take butter and they'll throw it right in the pan, in the really super screaming hot saute pan, and it'll end up like it turns into this like liquidy gross mess, right? You don't want that. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll either shut the heat off or I'll move that pan off and put the butter in the pan and use the residual heat from the pan to make the sauce. That is something to keep in mind too. Just pay attention to the temperatures, understand when you need things to be screaming hot and when you don't. A lot of times you can cook shrimp at a lower temp as well. You add them in later. That's kind of a subcategory of things that I've seen people get wrong too, is they will put things in at the wrong time. You know, like you can put your garlic in first, but you got to be extremely careful if you're using extremely hot saute pan, because you don't want to get that garlic will go from blonde to like burnt in like a second. So it's important that you put those in when you can actually pay attention to them and when you know that you're going to be using other ingredients to cool the pan off in order to get the job done. Now, in addition to this, another thing that I've seen new cooks get wrong is not preheating their pans. That is 99% of the reason why why the food is sticking in your pan, is you're putting it in a cold hand. It's because you're putting it in a cold pan, or you're putting it in a pan that isn't hot enough. Like when you get your pans, you want to always have pans going on saute. I mean, this is pretty much turning into like new saute cook things. This is true for a flat top too, but like usually you're turning the flat top onto like 350, 400 degrees, and it's staying just like that, and as long as you're not losing heat, then there's nothing really to worry about. So this really is more of like a saute kind of thing. You want to always have at least one pan. On a busy night, you're going to want to have more than that. You get new pans on the stove, get them on, get them hot, get your stuff in there. When you get an order for something, you already have a pan on the stove, right? You already have a pan, it's already on the stove, it's already hot, throw your stuff in there, start working. Saute is like my favorite station. I love saute. Saute is so much fun, but it's really easy to get behind and to screw up if you're not doing it right. Overmixing. Something else that I've seen a lot of cooks do as a mistake is when you're working with beef and you're doing meatballs or meatloaf or anything that requires mixing, you want to mess with the beef as little as possible. If you overmix the beef, you're going to end up with this really springy, spongy kind of texture, and you don't want that. I mean, same with hamburgers and stuff like that. Like hamburgers, the rule of thumb with beef, in most cases, there will be times where this isn't true, but in like 99% of cases, the less you do to the beef, the better. Mixing it, just barely mixing it enough, getting a lot of your other ingredients mixed together first and then adding it and then just kind of folding it and mixing it. And then as soon as things are incorporated, be done with it. You'll see this a lot with people when they make meatloaf or whatever, meatballs, Salisbury steak, any of that kind of that mixing stuff. They'll put it in the mixer with a dough hook or something if they got to do like a big batch of it, and then they'll just turn it on and leave it alone and forget all about it. Then when they come back to it, you'll know if you overmix the beef, because it'll almost look like the proteins are starting to create like strings in a way. It's hard to explain. They're not literal strings, but basically you'll see the fat will like start almost melting, and it'll kind of turn into like this weird, it's a weird texture. But if it looks like that, you more than likely overmixed it. While we're on the subject of meat in general, rest your meat. That is something I see new cooks do all the time, and a lot of it is timing issues. Go back to, I mean, this can be saute or flat top or, grill or whatever. You have to take resting time into account when you are cooking your food. So if you cook, it doesn't matter if you're putting a steak in a pan and cooking it, or if you're putting it on a grill or in an oven or whatever it is. Resting your meat is super important, and you have to take the temperature into account, and you want it low. For me personally, I found the best results at about 15 degrees, taking it off at about 15 degrees, right? So if you need to cook something at 145, if you take it off like in the 130 to 133 range thereabout, it will get really close to that temperature by the time it's time to serve. And then you put it on there, you let the steak rest, right? And that's something else on a side note. Steaks, a lot of times the grill will determine the pace of the rest of the kitchen, because if you have an 8-ounce filet, I really hope that your work doesn't have you butterfly like thick cuts of meat. Cook them in the oven, like get them as done as you can on the thing. And then if you've got to do something like medium or medium well, put it in the oven for the rest of the time or whatever. A lot of times grill will determine the pace of the kitchen because meat on average takes longer. So you get a well done or a mid well or even sometimes a medium, you get a steak like that. If you think about it, like a saute station, it doesn't take much to throw everything together and get it going. You could have something done in like 5 to 6 minutes, thereabout, maybe even faster, depending on what you're making. Salad, just compile everything. Flat top, maybe you're doing hot sandwiches. You got to heat some meat up on there really quick that was already, it was prepped up, and you just throw it on there and cook it, chop it up or whatever, throw it on some bread, French dip or something. But grill, you got a thick New York strip, you got a thick T-bone with bone in, big thick pork chops, big fat chicken breast. And so a lot of times you'll get the ticket and then you have to communicate to them, like when you're getting close. Basically your meat's going to bleed all over. So you want a specific plate. So as a joke, we actually talked about this mythical chef band called Blood Plate. Basically, like we were talking, we were like, how metal would it be to have a metal band called like Blood Plate? Like we're Blood Plate. I have that hoodie in the shop if you're interested in that. But anyways, the steak rests on the blood plate. You take the carryover temperature into account. That's why if you ever heard somebody complain because the steak was overcooked and you're like, oh man, I temped the steak out on the grill and it said it was fine. Well, the steak was still cooking, right? It was still cooking when you put it on the plate, and it was still cooking when the server took it out, and it went up another 15 degrees or even 10, whatever. Resting time is going to be partially dependent, or well, not partially. Resting time is going to be dependent on the cut of meat and how thick it is. And the chef should know, the exec should know how long different things need rested for. I don't care if you are only halfway through the cooking process. Make sure you're tasting your food. Sauces reduce, right? Seasonings burn. Things can get oversalted. Some places use salted butter. I am against salted butter, unsalted butter all the way. I want to control my salt levels. Some seasonings actually require less overall. Nutmeg, allspice, cinnamon, cumin. Actually, name some spices below that you can really end up overdoing. Saffron is another one. That's expensive anyway, so you don't want to use that. Really, like anything that's got like a really bitter, hardcore flavor. Like if you're doing a bechamel sauce, you don't need a lot of nutmeg. You don't need to sit there and dump like tablespoons of nutmeg into it. You'll ruin it, right? Then you almost get like your mouth will almost like get numb from there being so many spices in there. Now, Indian cooking uses a ton of spices. Your spices and your seasoning is going to be a lot different if you're doing something like a vindaloo or a masala or something like that. Generally speaking, taste the food. The rule of thumb, if you're not comfortable around seasonings yet, the number one rule of thumb is you can always add more, right? 100% of the time, you can always add more to a dish. Taste it, do a palate cleanser, drink some water, come back later, taste it again, adjust the seasoning as you need to. 9 out of 10 times when it's bland, it's because it just needs more salt. Another way, you can end up over seasoning the dish by tasting it too much, right? That's why I said a palate cleanser. You're over tasting and you kind of get used to the seasoning level and you think, oh, it needs more. And then you add more and you taste it again. You add more and then pretty soon somebody else comes up to it and they're like, what the hell did you do to this? Like, ugh.
Brother, ugh. What's that?
Another mistakes I've seen a lot of new cooks make is not using heavy pans for cream soups or a double boiler. You want to basically indirect heat for any kind of cream soup, anything that you're, any kind of sauce you make, like I talked about bechamel earlier, using milk or heavy cream or anything like that in those kind of sauces. It's really easy. Like if you use an induction burner for a lot of these sauces, it actually is easier because you can control the exact temperature. So that milk will scald if it's too hot, but you can keep the induction burner at like 225, 250, come crank it up a little bit, add some stuff to it, taste it. If you see it over boiling, you can turn it back down. I really like induction burners. If you don't have that and you just have a stovetop, an extremely heavy bottomed pan, something like the heaviest pan you have is what you want to use for a cream soup. But ideally, if you have a double boiler, that's even better because there's no way you're going to burn it in a double boiler. Another mistake I've seen new cooks make, and I don't know how long these types of cooks will make it in the industry, is the cooks that seem to know everything and not being humble, not accepting criticism, giving the I know response is the absolute worst thing you could do. If you knew, you wouldn't have done it that way. One other thing that I've seen new cooks do is not pay attention to their timing. And because of that, they will usually do one task, finish that task, and then they'll move on to the next task and do that task. When you're working like I've hammered on saute like pretty much the whole video. When you're working saute, when you're doing prep, when you're doing things, it's more about efficiency and finding that balance between how much you can do and how much attention you can pay to it. Obviously, if you're going to be doing things like cutting onions, maybe the sauce I was talking about earlier, maybe you can start that sauce, put it on at a low temp or a double boiler, and then cut onions while that sauce is going, instead of cutting the onions and then going to the sauce. And then the chef comes in and he's like, why isn't the soup started yet? And you're like, well, I was cutting onions. And it's like, well, you don't need to be in front of the soup the whole time. You know, you can get the water boiling, get the salt in the water, get the water boiling for pasta, and then go chop lettuce, for example. You know, then just pay attention to that. Think about it. I don't know if you're allowed to be with your phone. I use my phone for everything. I do the order on my phone. I'll put timers, alarms, like all of that stuff. Set timer, set alarm, go into notepads, you know, put notes down, whatever you have to do. And, you know, get your water started, get your prep going. Then you know that, okay, the water's probably boiling now. Go throw the pasta in the water, stir it, do what you got to do with that. Go back, do a little bit of stuff. You know, try to stay within generally the same area, make sure the pasta doesn't overboil, and just do multiple steps, do multiple things at once. The sous chef, the person training you, the cook lead, the executive chef, they aren't going to chew you out for it, but they will try to train that out of you and get you to doing like multiple things. If you've been doing this for a while, I would like to hear what you think are some of the most common mistakes that you've seen new cooks make. It could be anything. Leave it down in the comments below. I read everything. And, you know, we're all here to help each other learn and grow. So if you've got anything that's on your list that I didn't include in there, put it down below. But in any case, I hope that was informative. I hope you guys have a wonderful, amazing day, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.